Okay, so welcome back to full stack web development and the Zero to Hero course. And so hopefully you watched the setup video. If you either feel very comfortable with what that entails, so it's how do we install our IDE, how to set up a local server, with Apache and our database, how to install Node, Composer, Git, and get our GitHub account, then you might skip it. Otherwise, please jump to that first video. You will see it up in that corner. What we want to talk about today, so just to remind you of the curriculum that we're going through. So today we are in number 2, concept, and this video will basically talk about the front-end and back-end, what that means. It's something that we have often heard, and to be honest, it is a little bit confusing due to the double use, especially of the term back-end, which is in userland often used to refer to like an admin panel, like a backend where you would do your administration and feed in new content and all that kind of stuff, which is not what we mean as developers when we say backend, in the context of dividing frontend and backend. And let me see what we want to achieve today. So first of all, what is the difference? So that's a terminology that you will hear a lot, and it has gotten very confusing nowadays because there's so many different paths of how you can build a web application. Again, we're going to look at a very classical setup, and from that perspective, what you see here is basically what we want to talk about today. So on a very, very simple level, front-end is everything that happens in your browser. Okay, so if I write a language that is executed in your browser, so namely JavaScript, then that language will execute in the browser. So even though it's served by a backend, when I make a request, we'll get into that in a second, then you would still execute the actual code in your browser and act accordingly. So a little bit about like how that usually works. So you have normally your first request. So let's say you go to yourwebsite.com. So what would happen is you make a connection to the server and request basically a particular form of endpoint. So let's just say normally the index file, right? And the server answers you with whatever it is set up to serve you with. So let's just say that's an HTML file for now. It's very easy. So in that HTML file, then again, there could be a script included that again says like, you know what, please go ahead and fetch a JavaScript file for me now. And you get that served as well. And then basically you start executing that JavaScript or not, depending on what the JavaScript is intended to do. So the big difference basically between front-end and back-end as a whole development concept, and you will hear that a lot, that basically that defines a full-stack developer is somebody who writes front-end code and back-end code. So a pure front-end developer is somebody who would, for example, write JavaScript applications that are not run in Node, but that are intended to be executed on the browser and then talk to either existing servers or APIs or microservices or you name it, or work together with a backend developer that would facilitate the custom functionality that is required to build that app. So a little bit of a history about that, and so back in the days, everything was basically backend. JavaScript wasn't in existence, and I asked for a particular document, and that document was delivered by a particular server, and my browser displayed it accordingly. Then things have become a little bit more complex, and basically with JavaScript growing out of a language that was a little bit belittled because it more or less, if you remember the 90s and all the little flashing elements on a web page, that was basically, the first birth of JavaScript when, there was particular activity done, I don't know, like blinking unicorns, you name it, that JavaScript would execute. But it wasn't really useful prior to AJAX calls. And AJAX calls are basically the capability of JavaScript to talk to the server while your application is running. So everything that we experience now, and this is, that behavior from native apps as well, but I mean, let's stay within the realm of web. Everything that just feels slick, where you say like, okay, nothing is really reloading, but I'm filling out a form and then it reacts accordingly. So what happens in the background is, of course, that your JavaScript, your browser, for example, reacts on a particular form, submit, and then sends it to the server and gets it back without you having to reload the whole page. And that's super important to understand, that you will always basically make a lot of requests for several reasons while you're operating a website that's basically running on your browser. So on a static web page, let's say I'm requesting a particular document, then requests only happen when I ask for a new file, right? So I get the HTML file. At this point, I could cut the internet off, and I could still read the document. And if I click a link, then it goes back and searches for what that means, what needs to be served now. So in a classical setup, everything was static. So I asked for a particular document, the document was presented, and even though I might have had some JavaScript that does something for me, it normally never went as far as to say like I'm going to substitute particular elements or functionalities on the browser within that document. I mean, I need to load a different document in order to do that. And so in a classical sense, you would simply write an HTML file. It would be served accordingly, and that's all that like used to be done. Now, of course, and you can see, like, I also put the database here, and in reality, this could be, doesn't really have to be a database. I mean, this could be now a server-to-server API. It could be all kinds of things. The important part for you to understand is that a secure database is not reachable by your browser. So there's always something, even with the what they now call serverless, and you will hear a lot about stuff like that, and microservices and all those kind of things that make it feel like you have direct access to a database are never direct access to a database. You will also hear about local databases, so like IndexedDB, for example, or local storage. So there is the possibility to save information that is structured like a database in basically at your local device. But needless to say, before that, we need to ensure that this information is something that you're allowed to actually obtain. So it's still relevant to say like, okay, no, the server facilitates the security bridge, right? This is the layer that needs to be there. If it is only in a pure CRUD application, it is only to ensure that the data that we're getting out of there or that we're writing to it is allowed to be either read or updated or inserted or whatever. So that is why, from our perspective, we can basically say, okay, this part up here is the backend, right? So this is the layer that we require to basically facilitate everything of the three things I mentioned. So first of all, we're serving the client, so your browser, what application needs to be run. So here you go. Here's your HTML. Here's your JavaScript. Here's your CSS. Here's whatever files you might require. And we're the ones basically ensuring everything that is necessary to say, like, okay, are you logged in? Is this a call that I can accept? Is this information that you sent me that I can accept, and so on. And then we talk to other services or databases and so on accordingly. And that is really important to understand that. So if you have a question about that, that basically needs to be understood. That so as a full stack developer, you are planning accordingly. So you make, for example, decisions that say, like, well, in the browser, so in the client, as we call it, I want to create as much functionality as possible to avoid particular things. For example, to avoid that I constantly have to make calls to the server to change whatever. It feels better for the user, so it's a user experience question. It's faster and it saves resources. So at the end of the day, it's also a cheaper solution for me. However, whenever I have to make security considerations, that might be a factor that I wanted to think about. It's like, okay, wait a second. So I'm want to create an appointment with someone, right? The server needs to facilitate that. So I should not be able to directly, like for example, do a peer-to-peer relation or talk to a database directly and all of that. Like that's not happening. That all goes over the server. At the same time, the server facilitates something that nowadays is mostly neglected, and that is search engine optimization. So a lot of people will start learning JavaScript as the only language, and then jump into full stack development, which basically means they have a Node.js server where they write their backend and probably a MongoDB, and then they write in the actual client with a framework they like React or Vue or Angular, you name it. So what's really important, and even if this is something that you're thinking about, what's really important to understand is that if you are writing JavaScript and if you're using a particular framework, you often make this mistake where you say, like, okay, so I'm going to use the front-end routing system. It's going to be a single page application, and all of that. So if you do that, you must understand that has implications on what Google knows about your site, and how many pages are indexed, and all of those kind of things. So there are ways around it. I mean, you can be super smart about it and basically generate, well, on a high level, I can generate something for Google, and then it's going to generate something else for the actual user. But that's going to be a very complicated topic, and SEO agencies are paid a ton of money to basically solve that problem for you. That is not necessarily a problem. However, if you serve everything from the server, it's a little bit clunky, right? So if I click on a link and basically then the complete page reloads, and let's say I have something really nice with pictures and all kinds of stuff, and then like, okay, and now I'm somewhere else, and all of the things is repetitive, right? It's always the same header, it's always the same footer I'm loading. So that makes it very, very slow to load and generates more traffic, right? But that's basically how WordPress works to this day. Is to basically say, okay, we're going to ensure that SEO is taken care of, and we're going to deliver accordingly. And all the kind of hacks you see around that are functional, but at the end of the day, kind of question, like, why would you use a tool that is not intended to be used in a certain way, just because it's popular? It really doesn't make any sense. So I don't know, a car is probably more common than a bicycle, in most countries at least. That doesn't necessarily mean that a car is a good choice to adapt it and modify it accordingly so you can go hiking with it. It simply doesn't make any sense. And or drive through the forest. A bicycle is then maybe still a better choice. So that's basically the important point that I really need you to understand is those considerations are all going to be something that we're going to look into. So it sounds very confusing and high level for you if you're not really familiar with actual coding yet, but it's something that needs to happen in your brain to understand that in reality, whenever we're running a website, everything that you see is the result of what's happening in your browser. Now, how did it get there is a more complicated question, but you never directly, look at it as something that is the result of a server. And that's very important to understand because most tutorials will guide you, especially when we talk about PHP. And by the way, it's one of the reasons it's such a hated language is because most people teach it wrong and most people use it in the wrong way. Never look at whenever you see like those spaghetti code things where there's a PHP tag somewhere and then, okay, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I see so many beginners having the problem that they don't understand why doesn't this interact? Why don't I have this information available right now? It's because the basic principle to understand that whatever your PHP does has ran before this even becomes a thing. Okay, then it's over. There was a particular request, PHP ran, or whatever, actually doesn't have to be PHP, whatever basically generates the output. Then you get served your web application or page or whatever. And from that moment on, this is at your end. So everything else needs to be either a new request or a JavaScript AJAX call in order to facilitate any kind of changes or capture any kind of user input and so on. And that's it. I'm going to keep this relatively short because please feel free if that is conceptually a problem. Write in the comments what are you missing from the understanding and so on, and why or how could I explain it. Well, yeah, no, it's really I have to keep it at such a high level because everybody works a little bit different in how conceptualized understanding works. So if that is not clear, please mention it in the comments, and we will get into it relatively soon. I'll try to answer as soon as possible, and try to clear that up and maybe provide additional information. And when we get into examples, when we get into actual coding, it will of course make more sense and it will come more natural to you. But at this point, that is something that you really need to understand, and full stack is basically therefore, in my opinion, such an important thing to start with. So even if you end up becoming a front-end developer or a back-end developer, I mean, normally if you start full stack, you will end up being a back-end developer if you want to specialize, because you have that understanding. So what I'm actually trying to explain to you is what this trivial understanding of how requests work makes the difference in what ability you have to progress fast and to become good at what you're doing. So a lot of people, I mean, they know a lot about languages and a lot about coding, but that's why they don't get web, and that's why they don't have snappy logical solutions for and rely on built frameworks, for example, that would tell them how certain things work, but they never understand the under the hood concept. And it's really that simple. It's just something that from the beginning you need to have in your mind how that works. And again, there's a lot of material on there, but normally people jump into something and then afterwards it's pretty hard to divvy it apart and explain after you expect a particular outcome that isn't happening. Okay, so in order to quickly show you that, I've set up a really small app. So what we're looking here, and please don't worry, there's nothing you really need to understand here from a coding perspective. This is the reason why I chose Node, should you be familiar with that markup, is so we stay within the same language, so in that case JavaScript. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through it so we can basically see what's the difference between a backend and a front end. So that's all there is. It's an index.js. That's basically what's running. So let me actually quickly see. So in line 1, what we do is we load Express that basically facilitates a server for us. And we set Pug, which is a particular template engine, as our view engine. And then we have 2 endpoints. So one would be get, and that would just render the demo, which we will look at in a second. And the next one would be call, which would simply return a JSON for us. So, and here we can see whether or not it's running. So let me quickly see what happens in the front end. So here we have an H1, and then there's a button that executes call, and call is this function that basically fetches it. So in that case, I might as well write localhost 3000 here, and then the call, and that'll get us hopefully what we want. So how would this look like? So let's just quickly do quickly run this. Okay, so it opens up here for me, that's fine. So let's inspect what happens here. So as you can see, this all now directly comes from the backend, right? So none of this is basically, I mean, this is really hard coded. This is not JavaScript that generates it, but this is actually what's happening here. So this comes directly from the server. Nowadays, you will find a lot of expressions for that. Even though I can generate that dynamically, this is normally referred to as the static part. And so what I also included here is a button. And that button, I mean, we discussed this before. Let's look at it a little bit better here. So this button will execute the function call, and then we're going to make a call. So let's see what that means. So here we're going to basically go back to the original. So like this is the URL that we're on currently, and we're going to say please go to call, and expect that to be a JSON, and then basically alert it accordingly. So alert is this annoying out of the box pop-up that we will see in a second. And so ideally that means we should get this, right? So here we render this, and then basically as soon as we click that one, we should make a call back to the network. Now let's see if that's the case. Okay, so we can see this is basically our response. Ajax call, that's exactly what we expected it to do. And I can basically see here in the DevTools that a call was made without reloading the page to this particular endpoint. See, this is what it resolved to. And this is our result. And that's basically exactly what we see. I can, of course, do this as often as I want to. And the difference being here, this call is basically just a static page. And so this comes from the backend. And then I make another call to the backend and receive additional information. So this sounds pretty primitive here. It's important to understand, you know, how those things work, because in reality that would be, for example, a login form now, or you know, like you post a comment, and in more complex applications, everything reacts accordingly. But just want to give you that as a small, you know, well, additional capability of understanding. Again, this doesn't, you don't have to follow the code actually, right? So what we talked about before is basically what I want you to understand, but this is how it would look like, just so you have a practical, well, example, so to speak. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I will go through this curriculum as I have time, and be sure to subscribe so you have the possibility to you know, get all the updates and the next steps. And soon we'll probably program pretty cool apps together. Thank you so much for listening.